Hi, welcome to another MYD Global episode. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. Have you ever been watching a disaster unfold on the television and wonder what you can donate to help the relief efforts? Well, today I'm talking to Juanita Rilling, who's a senior humanitarian advisor who's been in the field for a number of years and has some great advice. In particular, why cash is king and why you might want to think twice before you donate used clothes or water bottles. So, stay tuned as you hear about what is important to donate after a disaster. Hi, Juanita. Thanks for being here today.
It is my pleasure.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, your background.
Okay, well, personal headlines first. Married for 36 years, two wonderful sons. I rode competitively for 25 years. I am a perennial soccer mom and a fire-breathing University of Maryland fan. And professionally, I worked for 27 years, I guess, in the United States Senate, and for 12 years at the U.S. Agency for International Development's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. It's a lot of acronyms, but USAID OFDA leads and coordinates all U.S. government humanitarian responses overseas. So I am now retired from all of that, and I am just a freelance senior humanitarian advisor.
That's awesome. Well, and I know, looking at some of the work you've done, I think you're perfect to speak to this topic today. One of the things that we often see is after a disaster happens, the donations start pouring in. Some are good and some are bad. So can you kind of talk about that challenge around donations?
Yes. After most major emergencies in actually the last 50 to 75 years, people donate things, material things that cannot be used in the early phases of a disaster response, and in fact, prevent many times responders from getting emergency supplies and services to survivors. And the way that works is, so after a disaster, there's a premium on flat, dry space so that responders can stage and manage their equipment and supplies. And all, creditable responders have their own stuff, so they don't need donations of more stuff. But people all over the country, I'll just confine it to the United States, people all over the country send typically used clothing, canned food, bottled water, and household goods at a time when the responders really need that space for their own equipment and supplies. And the stuff arrives literally in metric tons in very short order and has to be moved out of the way. And moving it out of the way requires relief workers and gasoline and heavy equipment and time, all of which are resources that are taken away from helping survivors in order to manage these donations. And it is what humanitarian organizations and responders call the second disaster, because it's almost as bad as the first.
So in your experience, have you seen someone, maybe, it's hard to say who's done it poorly, but some best practices, some things that went well, some things that you said, man, if they had a plan in place, this could have gone so much better?
Yes. In 2013, there was flooding in Colorado. There were floods from Colorado Springs to Fort Collins. And the Colorado Department of Public Safety teamed up with Colorado Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, the VOAD, and created a website, helpcoloradonow.org. And on that website, they gave all kinds of great information for donors who wanted to contribute to the relief effort. And at some point, they put in big block letters on the homepage of the website, "Thank you for used clothing. We don't need any more used clothing." And they said what they did need and what they didn't need. Perfect. And it was brilliant. It was perfect. And they must have arranged for all the media who were covering these floods to point to this website. And so, it's really where everyone focused, and it gave specific, explicit directions to donors on how to do the most good. And when I talked to a woman from the VOAD after the emergency was over, she said, the donation, they really didn't have a big donations problem. And it was because they did excellent, public relations and in telling people what would be helpful. That's the best example, and it
That's
worked.
great, because I know that, there's stories here in Canada where you've had a disaster happen, and just like you said, you'll get used clothing and things that nobody would even want. But
Yeah.
it's like, oh, here's used clothing, toys, whatever, and it ends up going in the landfill. And so you just think that's not the point. I mean, people want to help, and so the more information you can give them on how to help with what people need, you'll have a far better response.
Yes. I got a very nice email from a young man who was involved in the response after Hurricane Sandy. And he said the used clothing was such a problem because it took up space in warehouses, in churches and schools, gymnasiums, and parking lots that was needed for the responders to manage their stuff. And he said sometimes getting what you don't need is worse than not getting what you do need. Yeah. And the problem is, and the thing that I emphasize when I talk to people is that these donations are not neutral. A lot of donors think, oh, well, I'll give, a cash donation or, a box of used clothing. It's the same. It's not the same. Cash donations are always the most efficient. I'll get to that in a minute. But these other donations require resources to manage, which is a cost to the response. So, if you look at a picture, sometimes there'll be pictures of parking lots covered in stuff. And a $1 donation to a charitable organization working on site is better for survivors than all of that stuff, because managing all of that stuff takes money and time and responders away from the response. It's a sort of theft from survivors. So cash donations are the best, and here's why. Yeah. And people don't like to hear it, and we'll get to that in a minute too. But the responding organizations that help communities get back on their feet, these are professionals. They come with their own equipment and highly trained individuals. They're like firefighters. And even a tiny cash donation to an organization that's responding enables them to meet needs as they change, because needs will change, especially in the first week of a disaster. People may require first search and rescue services, then shelter services, medical services, family reunification, all of which are helped by cash donations, and frankly, none of which are helped with used clothing. But cash donations enable responding organizations to purchase supplies in the local area, because even in the worst disaster, there's always a healthy perimeter of markets from which supplies can be purchased, and that supports recovery of the local economy. It speeds it. And finally, in areas where there's, areas where there are ethnic populations, cash donations guarantee that the supplies will be culturally appropriate, which is important, especially in overseas operations, but in the United States as well. So cash really is the best.
And one of the things, and maybe you can speak to this, but I would think it becomes even more important when you have a community in, say, an island community, where getting physical supplies to them, you've got the added variable of time and speed to getting them to you. So cash in that case, I think, would almost be, even more important.
Yes. And people don't like to part with cash. And I totally understand. And frankly, I don't either. But it's important to vet the organizations you're thinking of giving cash to. So it's easy to do. There's all the charity watchdogs. There's givewell.org, charitynavigator.org, Charity Watch, and the Better Business Bureau's Wise Giving Alliance. These organizations live to rank charities according to all kinds of criteria regarding programmatic and fiscal integrity. And so when I'm going to give, I go to one of those websites and look at the organizations I'm thinking of giving to, and I will know how my money is spent. Also, whenever a big emergency happens, lots of charities will have fund drives, but not all charities are working with survivors. So I encourage people, if you want to help survivors, then look at the newspaper or the news, and find out what organizations are working directly with disaster affected people and donate money to them, because they're working, you can see it, and they need your cash donations.
Yeah, no, that's great. So if you were advising, say, I mean, large communities probably have more capacity to do some of this. If you're advising a smaller community on how to become some steps they can take now to avoid this in the case something like this does happen. So what would be some just very practical, easy, low cost things they could look into?
I would develop relationships with local and state media, and have agree on a spokesperson or a spokes organization that will be the public face of the disaster when it occurs.
Right.
So the U.S. voluntary organizations active in disaster are kind of perfect for this. There are VOADs all over the country. They have a national organization in Virginia, and these are experienced people who are experienced in disaster response who can speak to the public about what is needed. But you need to set up the relationships with the VOAD and the media and any local charitable organizations who are likely to work with the community once a disaster occurs. But everybody needs to be on the same page about the script, what you say, what you tell people to send and not send. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, to encourage cash donation, responsible cash donations.
Yeah, and I know when we're out meeting with communities, teaching them about resilience and recovery, we say cash is king. And
Yes.
So I'm happy to hear that what we're telling people is actually, backed up by people like yourself with all the experience in the area. Is there anything else that maybe we haven't touched on before we wrap up?
I guess I'd like to hammer a little harder on used clothing, because I've heard from people who are working in the field that, used clothing, usually people are in a big hurry to send it so that it's not always clean, it's not sorted, and it arrives and sits in areas that are humid. There's no climate controlled warehousing. There isn't any after disaster because there's generally no electricity. So this used clothing will sit in piles outside, and it gets moldy. So mold in small quantities is an allergen, but in big quantities, it's a toxin. And moldy clothing attracts snakes and rats. Unfortunately, this is the reality we never talk about. So when you send big bales of used clothing, it is a health hazard to responders and to anyone in any community who has to deal with it. And you can look on the internet and see photographs of really humongous piles of used clothing. Just remember, they're a health hazard for responders. And in my experience, and this is, closing in on 20 years of experience in disaster response, used clothing is hardly ever needed. I only remember once or twice when in a cold winter there were coat drives, but other than that, there's used clothing. It's everywhere, especially in a hurricane situation. All the houses are cracked open. There is clothing everywhere, and it's just not needed.
Yeah. Wow.
And just one more thing, a caution about bottled water. So people like to send bottled water because everybody knows you can live for a long time without food, but not so for bottled water. But remember that, responders, one of the first things the responding organizations do is try to build up the water supply. It's like almost a first priority along with search and rescue. And they try to get clean water sources to people, usually with water purification units, which are machines that purify local water sources. Nonetheless, people send millions of bottles of water, hundreds and thousands of bottles of water to these areas where there are no recycling programs after disaster. It's one of the last things that'll happen. So all of the bottles, the only way out of town for bottles is in the nearest waterway. And, there's a picture of this after Haiti, and which accounts for those continent-sized plastic gyres in the ocean in all likelihood. So it's better not to send bottled water unless a charity specifically asks for it. And this is the last thing I will say, is that it's better not to send any material thing that has not been specifically requested by a responding organization. Because if they do, they will put up on their website exactly what is needed, drop-off points, and an end date to the drive. But outside of that, whatever material things you send may actually get in the way of sending goods and services to survivors.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, the advice you've given is so practical. It's, cash for sure is the first priority. Your qualifications around the clothing and the water. I mean, you see it all the time. I think it was Puerto Rico where you saw a picture of I don't know how many thousands of water bottles that had just been sitting there somewhere, never been distributed, and you just think, that has now just contributed to the problem even more than a solution.
Yes.
So, thank you so much. And I know that those communities that will be watching this is great advice for them to think in advance. How can we prepare for this? Because I think it's one of the things people don't think about in advance, and then it happens because people do want to help. They want to reach out. They see these terrible photos. They say, oh, I have a bunch of clothes I can give. Well, think twice. And that's kind of, with all your experience, I think you've seen it on the front lines, and you see what works and what doesn't. So
yes.
Thank you.
There's an old proverb that says desire without knowledge is not good. And this is exhibit A.
Well, thank you. We'll leave it on that proverb. And once again, Juanita, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today. And take care.
You too.